Hi, Spring fans. Welcome to another installment of Spring Tips. I have a problem. No, not that kind of problem. A different kind. I have a web application, a client-side JavaScript application that I want to connect to a backend API, and I want to secure the whole thing. And I want to use the Spring authorization server. This is an ideal setup, one which I've discussed in previous videos when we looked at the Spring authorization server. I'm not going to rehash all of that. What I do want to talk about is the thing that glues all these things together, namely the gateway. In my architecture, I'm going to have a gateway that sits in front of both the static CDN delivered or statically hosted or just served JavaScript pages on one service and the backend API that the JavaScript application will talk to. That's the gateway. And in previous videos and previous discussions, we've looked at using the reactive Spring Cloud Gateway to make short work of exactly this, right? The architecture is very simple. You make a request to the gateway. The gateway looks for the request and it says, oh, this request begins with the prefix API /. So all those requests are sent onward to the API, the backend API service, and then everything else is sent to the static website, the JavaScript, the CSS, the whatever, all the static stuff that we send back to the client. And because everything is on the same port, because it's all being rendered through the gateway, the JavaScript code ends up being miraculously less encumbered by things like cross-origin request scripting, and we don't have to deal with passing around JOT tokens either, because we can use the Spring authorization server to lock down the gateway. The result is that no request ends up at the client without having been given a token from the authorization server. So there's no need to even bother building in logic in the JavaScript code to propagate the JWT token at all in the first place. You'll never see that page. You'll never see any of those assets until the authorization server has had its say and giving you a token. And so it's a really useful architecture. In previous videos, we looked at Spring Cloud Gateway. I've looked at Spring Cloud Gateway, at least a couple of times over the years. No, 3 times, I think. I mean, I'm a huge fan, and obviously I've looked at it in the context of other things more times than that as well. But in this video, friends, I want to look at a new flavor, a new variant, actually 2 new flavors, 2 new variants of the Spring Cloud Gateway project. Spring Cloud Gateway is an API gateway. It gives you the ability to handle sort of generic cross-cutting network kinds of concerns. And remember, HTTP is one of the really powerful protocols on the internet because it gives you the ability to filter, right? You can actually put things in between you and the downstream final sort of recipient of the request, and neither side needs to know, right? I can send a request to an HTTP service, not knowing that it in turn is sending that request onward to 5 other services, right? And those services don't need to know that the original originating request came from anyone besides the hop or the node that sent them the request in the first place, the sort of penultimate node before them. And this is the power of HTTP, right? It's easily composed. You can insert things in between. And here you get a lot of power through something like a gateway. And there are a good many API gateways on the market, but none so easy, approachable, or powerful, I think, as Spring Cloud Gateway. And we built the original Spring Cloud Gateway using the reactive mechanism, the reactive APIs in Spring Framework 5.0, right? Way back in 2017, if you can remember that far back. It feels like 1,000,005 years. That was a full 3 years before the COVID pandemic, or BC. And so that made perfect sense because we wanted non-blocking I/O. We wanted to be able to scale to handle as much traffic as you could send at it. And, if you think about it, a gateway has to be very scalable. Remember, it's not just going to handle all the traffic that your API has. It's going to handle all the traffic that your API has, your JavaScript and your CSS. It's going to handle all the traffic that a number of different APIs has, right? This is the one thing where you really cannot skimp on scale. And so we didn't bother building a servlet-based blocking implementation way back when because there was really no point, right? Reactive was just a far better fit for this use case. Until now, right? Now we have Java 21. Now we have Java 21, and you know what? Frankly, the programming model might be sort of interesting for people. So we decided to revisit the solution, the space. We still have this wonderful reactive Spring Cloud Gateway, and that's a very good choice. But if you're really insistent, if you really want to build on the servlet stack and you want that, we have just the thing for you. And in fact, I think as programming models go, this actually might be a little bit more approachable for people who haven't yet dealt with the existing reactive Spring Cloud Gateway implementation. Because this new approach fits right in, it slides right in naturally with 2 of Spring's component models, the functional router function style that we saw then proliferated into the servlet stack-based Spring MVC, and regular, controller handler methods, right? Get mapping, put mapping, post mapping, etc. So we have two different implementations, two different styles, both of which look very different from the old reactive Spring Cloud Gateway DSL. It might take a little bit of upskilling, a little bit of sort of trial and error to kind of get used to this. But if you've already used Spring MVC, you're arguably further ahead in your knowledge and what you need to know to use this Spring MVC based Spring Cloud Gateway than you would be if you had just started with Spring Cloud Gateway and the reactive stack. So I think it's really interesting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's dive right into it. We've got an auth service. This is just an authorization server. It's an IDP, an identity provider, and it has a single client called CRM and a client secret called CRM, and it's asking for permission for these particular flows, these grant types. We want to redirect to our gateway node. Okay, very important here. So the auth server has a client that we've registered. A client it describes the shape of the thing that might access the authorization server on behalf of a user. So an Android app, a web app, an iPhone app, an iPad, the PlayStation, whatever. All of these are apps, and we call them clients in the OAuth world. So this client is acting on behalf of any number of users, 0 to n users, that might authenticate in terms of that app. That is to say, you might install this iPhone app and then need to log in to your company's service. The client, the actual iPhone code, would use an OAuth library and say, I am acting as this client called CRM on behalf of Josh, and Josh wants to log in, but we don't want Josh to log in the iPhone code. We want Josh to log in on a well-known, trusted sort of console, a page where he can enter his credentials, sure that it's safe and secure. So we've got this client, and we've got just one user in this case. It's called user, and the password is PW. Okay. Now I've bcrypt encoded these two. I did this using the Spring CLI. I went Spring encode password, and I got this back out. Okay. And so you can put in, password, right? And you get another string. Note, however, that you can encode the same thing and get multiple values that are different. So you know that this is not the same as this, and yet they will cryptographically be the same. They will be, you can assert that this value is equal to the encoded version of this value, okay? Okay, so this is just Spring Auth server. It's already up and running. We have a simple API. The API has a couple of endpoints that we want to talk to. One gives me the currently logged in user, right? So we go here, you can see that we have an endpoint called /me that just returns a JSON structure, which I'm using a map, and the JSON structure has one attribute called name, which has the current authenticated principal's name. This authorization, this application is protected by the Spring Security resource server abstraction. So basically I'm locking down the service with a filter. This is like a little bit of a shield around the web app, and I'm saying this filter will reject any request to the API that doesn't have a token. And so there's nothing really fancy beyond that, but it's just nice to know that that's there. We have also a simple HTTP controller where you can make a purchase. So you post to the purchases endpoint with the payload of a purchase, and you can inject the current authenticated user. And that in turn gets routed to the purchase service where you pass in the principal's name, the product ID, and the quantity, and so on. And then you get back the ID, the order ID, basically, that you can use. So I want to use all these APIs now from my JavaScript, okay? And I won't ruin your day. I won't ruin your day with too much JavaScript, but basically, when the window loads, we get the current user, right? We call the API /me. Remember what we said. We're going to have a simple gateway, and it's going to have two paths, right? A fork in the road, /API / goes to the backend API service that we just looked at, and everything else, under / goes to the static HTML page here. Okay, so the static HTML page is going to be sending a request to /API /me. It's going to get the JSON structure back, and I'm just going to print that out on the page. And if somebody clicks on the button, then we'll call the purchase endpoint. We're going to make a post call to API purchases with some data in it. And this is just some dummy data. Okay, so I've got two use cases here. I want to get the API. I want to support both post and get. And I want to route also to the static JavaScript assets as well. So I've got three different routes through the gateway that I need to make sure work. the same route, both get and post to the API, and the other route to the UI, just to return, just for the HTTP get verb. And this is running, this UI, the static UI, is just running in the background. I've just used Python's embedded HTTP server there just to create a little HTTP server for the index.html, which is served on port 9000, all right? Okay, good. So we've got all that. Now let's go ahead and create a brand new project here at start.spring.io. And remember, we need to lock down access to the gateway with OAuth, so it needs to be aware of the authorization server. We need to make requests to the downstream service using the gateway itself. We're using Spring MVC, not the reactive stack. So we need Spring MVC. We need GraalVM, of course, so we'll go ahead and add that. So let's go ahead and build this, Java 21. I'm going to call this a gateway. Let's go ahead and specify Maven. We use Java 21. I'm going to call this a gateway. We're going to add GraalVM, native image support, web support, gateway support, right? Not the reactive gateway in this case, the new one, the MVC gateway. Do we want anything else? Yes, we do. We want the OAuth client, right? Remember, we want this thing to act as a client to the downstream service and to the authorization server. So the client is kind of like the resource server. It's a filter that will sit there protecting our web app and rejecting any requests that don't have a token, but it goes one step further. It'll also handle incepting the token in the first place. That is to say, it'll redirect you to the authorization server and then wait for you to get a token. And then when you redirect back to the gateway, it'll know that you're finishing the OAuth dance with the authorization server, and it'll set up a session with the token. And we want to make sure, thus, that when you make a request to the gateway that has already authenticated, that you convey, you relay that token onward to the downstream API. This is called being a token relay. It's another thing that a gateway is really good at. So let's go ahead and set all this up. We're going to go ahead and hit generate and download this, and we'll open it up in our IDE. Okay, so CD downloads. Oh, gateway. Okay, here's our public static void main application. Let's talk about this. So the first things first, this is going to be an OAuth client. So we need to make sure that works out of the box. Let's go to the configuration here. This is going to be an OAuth client. Let's make sure that works. Here's the configuration. Basically, I'm telling the OAuth mechanism here in the gateway about our authorization server running on port 9090. I'm telling it about the client we intend to act as. I'm telling it where to expect the redirect to be, right? So the final step of the authorization server will be to forward back to this URI, right? I'm just making sure this lines up with what the authorization server is expecting to do. And that's it, basically, right? And this is the secret that we have encrypted on the authorization server. I should really encrypt it here as well, but it's a demo, okay? Okay, so that's the first thing. What else do I want to do? I want to run this on a certain port, right? So I'm going to run this on port 1010. And it's very important to remember that because we're using Spring Security and we're doing so across the domain, right? We've got the auth server, we've got the gateway, and we've got the API. We want to make sure that we want to make sure that our cookies don't clobber each other. So it's very important that we approach the gateway node via some domain that is different from localhost. When you make a request to the gateway on host 127.0.0.1:1010, remember you got to do that instead of saying localhost 1010, okay? Trust me, you'll get all sorts of weird, mysterious, hard to debug issues if you don't. Okay, so I'm happy with this. Let's go ahead and start writing some code. And again, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing we want to do is handle two different routes, okay? So let's describe those routes here. Static final string UI host, okay? And the host is HTTP, and it's on, 9000? That's where the static HTML page is, right? And the other one is the API host, and this is on 8080, okay? So that's the host. Now, what about the prefix? What is the routing, Well, in this one, we'll say UI prefix, okay, equals this. So everything to / and beyond should be sent as is, unchanged to the UI. So if we go to gateway/styles.css, it'll send the request to UI host /styles.css. On the other hand, for the API, if we make a request to the gateway /API me or purchases, it'll send the request onward to localhost 8080 /me /purchases. How? Well, that's the fun. Let's dive right into that. Let's look at the UI routing. And this one's actually really easy. We're going to create a simple HTTP controller that does that. And so I'm just going to add @controller @response body to the application, and I'll create an endpoint here. So UI prefix, and then we want to say UI prefix wildcard. Okay, so I'm going to create a new variable here called wildcard, and we'll just make that equal to that. Okay, so this is that plus that, and we're going to return a response entity UI. Okay, and then what? Well, we're not handling the request ourselves. We're forwarding the request, and so Spring Cloud Gateway gives us a new object, but it's not included in the starter. You have to actually add it manually, sadly, and it took me a minute to figure this out. So just to make it easy, just do that. Get rid of the word starter, copy the dependency, and then add that to the class path, and now you'll get the correct one. Okay, so proxy exchange. Notice that there are two of them. This one is not the one you want. You want the one with the generic type. They're both in Spring Cloud Gateway, but one is more important than the other, okay? So here's the request, and I'm going to say request.get, okay? What am I going to get? I'm going to get the URI.create, passing in a call to UI host. And of course, the question is, what is the path that we're sending the request to? Well, you can actually ask for the path. And here I have UI prefix as the variable there. So this is this operation here is going to look at the prefix. It's going to get everything in the incoming request as represented by the special object here after this prefix. Well, of course, that's basically everything. And then we're going to send it onward to the host like that. And of course, if this prefix had been /API, then this operation path with the API in there would have gotten me everything after /API. So it's very easy to sort of take the path of the incoming request and then add it or change it or whatever, and then send it onward to the downstream endpoint. So this is the very first one. Already, pretty straightforward. It's a response entity. You've seen that before. It's a controller handler method. It's using get mapping, it's mapping URLs in there in the annotation, and it's just producing a response. Couldn't get easier, right? Very, very simple. Okay, so that's one style, and maybe you could create a separate controller as well. I'm just particularly lazy, so I'm doing that here as well. What about the call to the API? Well, remember, we want to support both GET and POST, so we're going to have something like this. Here, this is using the functional style for creating HTTP endpoints. This is actually part of Spring MVC. It's been there for 7+ odd years. Well, actually, the reactive support came out in 2017. This came out a little bit later. I think it was like Spring Framework 5.1 or .2 or something like that. But it's been here for the better part of a decade, either way, no matter how you describe it. So this is the servlet-based functional API for describing HTTP endpoints. So we're saying we have a route, and we're matching any HTTP posts headed to /API/wildcard, okay? And then we're going to send it, if it matches that, we're going to use this nice handler method from Spring Cloud Gateway's DSL to send the request onward to this URL, localhost 8080. But not before we do some rewrites. We're going to use filters here. And you can see you can put filters before, you can have generic filters, and you can have after filters. I don't have any after filters here. But this is, think of this like a servlet filter. This is exactly what that is, actually. And so we're going to take the incoming request. We're going to use this nice operator from the DSL in Spring Cloud function called before filter functions to rewrite the path. And we're going to rewrite the path. We're going to say, given a request to /API/ and then we're using sort of a regular expression here to capture the path after the prefix. Given that request, replace it with just / and then the segment that was captured in the regular expression. So we're going to drop the prefix, okay? So all requests headed to API prefix / wildcard. Before we send it off to HTTP, we'll strip the prefix away from it and then keep and preserve the path segment and then send that off on the outbound request. And then finally, we also want to, act as a token relay. We want to send any token that we've got onward to the downstream service. Okay, so this is for posts. Let's do the same for GET. Okay, there we go. And we're going to say GET. And very good. So that's the same exact thing. By the way, this is a builder. So I could have actually, if I wanted to, I could factor out that whole chain there and then just drop this and then reuse this. I could have a factory method to build that or something and then customize just the last mile here, right, like that. But whatever, you understand what I'm doing. I'm duplicating this so you can kind of see what's happening. Okay, so we've got 3 different beans here, each describing a custom sort of gateway exchange. You can also do this all in one thing, right? I'm doing separate, but it's not unreasonable to then compose, to say I wanted to have this route and then this route and then this route etc. You can do that. The DSL certainly supports that. Bear in mind, there is also ordering. It happens to work out in this case. But if you, for example, had a router function to /*, and you had it, if it appeared in such a way as to appear earlier on in the chain, well, of course, that would capture all requests, even those that would otherwise be handled by this, because it's greedy, right? It matches all of the path. Anything in the path will match, and so it will never get to this one. So we want to make sure that these come first, okay? And that's what's happening here, but it's not by accident. Make sure you are aware of that. Make sure you take care of ordering, okay? We've got a simple gateway. Let's see if it's working. All right, so it's up and running. It's been running for a long time now. Let's go to the browser. I'm going to go to private mode here, incognito, 127.0.0.1. It redirected me to the auth server. Okay, no problem. The user is user, and the password is password, or PW. We log in, and there we go. Now we're logged into this static. Remember, we're back at the gateway. It did the OAuth dance. We're back at the gateway, 127.0.0.1.10.10. That's the gateway over here, right? And on the gateway, we're accessing /, which is, any web server will serve index.html whenever you go to /. So the Python code that is serving up our index, we don't have to say index.html, but I suppose we could. We could say index.html and we get the same page, right? This is equivalent. But the point is, the UI is getting everything that doesn't have, the static site Python code is serving up everything except for the stuff that happens to be underneath API /, okay? So, and you can see that here. I'm using JavaScript here to get the results. So let's see if I make a checkout, what happens. Remember, in the JavaScript code, there's an event listener here added to the button that we've got down there called checkout. When you click on the button, we call the purchase endpoint, send details about a product or just an imagined product that you're looking at in the post, and wait for the response, and the response has an ID. So we want to await for the purchase, with the current user's name, right, which we get from calling API me, and then we take the response and use it to update the DOM with the current purchase ID, Okay, so let's try that. We'll click on that, and you can see we got one more problem. And the reason this is failing, if you look at the output there, it says status 403, not 401. So 401 means not authorized. 403 means the credentials are basically okay, at least you can assume as much, but there's something else wrong, and therefore you're not authorized. You don't have the right to do what you're trying to do. And the reason that's kicking in, this is still a security-related error, but it's not the one that would have stopped us before. Clearly we have permission to be here, or at least we have permission to make this request to show the HTML page, but we don't have permission to do a post. The reason is because on the gateway, we have the support for the OAuth client, but we didn't disable the CSRF cross-site request forgery protection, which kicks in when you have an HTTP post. So here's our new HTTP security. I'm re-declaring that this gateway code it's going to support OAuth 2 login. It's going to support OAuth 2 client support with the defaults. That's customizer.with defaults. Basically, I just prefixed it. Customizer.with defaults, like that. And we've got here we're disabling CORS and CSRF, and we're locking down every endpoint. So no URL, no request to the gateway can proceed without being authenticated, and that can only be done through OAuth over here. Okay, so I'm going to register this security filter chain. We'll restart the code, and now check out, and you get the ID. It actually produced a response instead of a failure when we tried to do the post. Not bad. Okay, final thing. I want to turn this gateway, which is basically an edge function, right? It's something that sits there and sits between me and my downstream services. I want this gateway to be as small and lightweight as possible, so I'm going to use GraalVM. But one thing you should know is that there is actually a limitation on the ability to use the Spring Cloud refresh scope in a GraalVM native image. And this implicitly brings in Spring Cloud Core, which in turn has that refresh scope. I'll say refresh scope enabled is false. Okay, this is for GraalVM, this right here. Only in GraalVM. All right, let's go ahead and compile the application as a GraalVM native image. All right, compilation is finished. Let's go ahead and run it. Target, gateway. Oh, the port is already in use, I'll bet. Yep, that's what it is. So let's go here. Stop that. Restart. There we go. The application is up and running in about 1/10 of a second, which is nice, right? It's been running for, the whole process has been running for about 100 milliseconds, but it's been, Spring and all the Java stuff took about 90 milliseconds. Very, very nice. So now if we go back to our web app, go here, we're logged in again do the checkout, everything is fine. Nice. We now have a super lightweight, very, very quick GraalVM compatible, gateway that we can use. And we've only begun to scratch the surface here. There's a ton of filters. You can do all sorts of things like circuit breaking and rate limiting and retries and circuit breaking and token relays and so on. I mean, I encourage you to watch the Spring Cloud Gateway Redux video I did a couple of years ago. It's on the reactive version of this, but you'll get an idea for what's possible. And it's pretty natural now, given these two different styles, the functional style and the controller handler method style. It's pretty natural to then apply those ideas that you've learned from that video and in the reactive world to this new paradigm, because it maps pretty naturally. I hope you got something out of this, my friends. As always, I encourage you to go start.spring.io, try it out. It's amazing. It's really, really productive, very, very fast. And me, frankly, I quite like this. This proxy exchange is really brilliant. It's really brilliant. This is actually really, this is exactly what I would like to see when I think about building a API gateway. I'm describing an HTTP request, so it only makes sense that I use the Spring MVC component model, and I then want to forward the request. So give me a thing that represents my link to some other service. It's called a proxy exchange. Very convenient. Go try it out. Let me know. As always, I'll see you next time.